exchange. Now, this is a very different focus than what you've just heard, so I hope you can switch gears with me. This exchange, no, just leave it there. The exchange is aimed to create new educational and research projects, but also to address gender inequalities and to make an intervention into Caribbean feminism from the specificities of geography, history, and culture of the Guyanas region. Now, the Guyanas is a rather strange place, and I think from Sao Paulo, from the south of Brazil, you probably don't think very much about the Guyanas up there. But we are bordering you, Brazil, and there are different ways in which the Guyanas are mapped and talked about. The first up here being a geological territory, which is called the Guyana Shield, which when you see that red border, and that includes a large part of Brazil, a large part of Venezuela, going into Colombia, and that is a geological structure called the Guyanas Highlands sometimes as well. It includes also the 3 Guyanas. Then we have, I think this map is not so clear, something that's called the 5 Guyanas, which is a geographic demarcation where you have the Spanish Guyana in Venezuela, the British Guyana, or formerly British Guyana, which is now Guyana, the Dutch Guyana, which is now Suriname, the French Guyana, which is still called French Guyana, and the state of Amapá in Brazil, which is also called the Portuguese or Brazilian Guyana, right? So we have the 5 Guyanas. But then we also have the social and political configurations of 3 countries, which, and you can see them here, of Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. And these are constituted through British, Dutch, and French colonialism, quite different from Spanish or Portuguese colonialism. And they sit on the top of Brazil and next to Venezuela, facing the Atlantic Ocean. And they are, and I'm going to talk more about this, they are quite integrated into the Caribbean region. Not so much South America, but the Caribbean. And this is the orientation of our project. So in our work with these Guyanas, and primarily Guyana and Suriname, it's the historical, cultural, social, and political connections with the Caribbean and the continuing positioning of the 3 Guyana nations as Caribbean countries that are significant and which inform the development of our gender studies project. The orientation to the Caribbean, rather than to the rest of South America, rather than to Brazil or Venezuela or Colombia, was forged through the colonial settlement patterns in the countries. The coastal areas were designated as easy to access from Europe and were developed for sugar cultivation under the Dutch, the British, and the French. And they really face the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see there. And the main cities and towns are concentrated on the coast. And we have then in the populations in the Guyanas, the European colonizers, right? This is on coastal populations. The indigenous people were kind of moved out from those coastland areas. The enslaved Africans who were brought to work on the sugar plantations, and after the abolition of slavery in the 1830s, the British and the Dutch particularly brought in workers, contract workers, indentured workers they're called, from Asia, from India, Java, and China, to work on the sugar plantations. So they took the place of the enslaved Africans. And today, particularly in Guyana and Suriname, Indians, people from India originally, right, who've been there for a couple of centuries, they make up the largest single ethnic group in both countries. And this is quite significantly different than many countries in the region, especially also in South America, but also in the Caribbean, to have this large Asian population, with Hinduism and Islam being very prominent religions in these 2 countries, right? And the hinterland is quite different. I mean, no, it's fine. The hinterland consists primarily of rainforests and savannas, and both countries don't have many roads connecting the coast to the hinterland, so it's mostly river traffic that connects them. And there are, some major indigenous populations in Guyana and Suriname, and in Suriname, several Maroon communities who established their territories in negotiation with the Dutch a couple of centuries ago, and are still very much alive and well and have retained a lot of their Africanisms. Today we also have descendants of European ranchers, the pork knockers, the garimperos, particularly from Brazil, and other parts of the Guyanas, who work the interiors of the two countries, particularly around the resources. Both countries are rich in mineral resources. Now, the borders between the Guyanas, especially in the hinterland, are very fluid and at times undetectable. People move around continuously between the countries, even though there are some points that are very strictly controlled as immigration points. But between Guyana and Suriname, in both countries, we have this idea of something called backtrack, and people talk about backtracking. And that means just going across the border, avoiding any immigration or migration checks, and going about your business on the other side, right? And backtracking is something that a lot of people do with goods, to visit family, and so forth. The nation-states of Suriname and Guyana are also full members of CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, which has its headquarters, the Secretariat in Guyana, and you see on that map the countries, the darker countries are the main countries of the Caribbean Community, the CARICOM, which is a trade and economic bloc that the Caribbean countries have formed with Guyana and Suriname, and where skilled workers can actually move quite freely between the countries, and that's been established and that's continuing. So Guyana and Suriname are really integrated into the Caribbean in this way, politically and economically. So we work with primarily, with Caribbean orientation, with populations and governments that identify themselves as Caribbean, as part of the Caribbean, while also maintaining a claim to being South American, right? And as I said, because of they border each other, the borders are very fluid, there's a sense of belonging to a specific region of the world that is also distinct from the Caribbean islands, as well as from its neighbors, Brazil and Venezuela, right? So we have this little block of countries that are quite unique in their composition. It's this distinct multi-territoriality, the multi-identification and belonging, and multiculturality that underpins the interest in developing a specific Inter-Guyana's feminist gender studies project. So, the project. Over the past several years, we've linked gender studies units at the University of Guyana and under Com University of Suriname around teaching and research interests, and with the 3 universities in Toronto, which have a large Guyanese diaspora, right? So that those of us who are living in Canada still feel very connected to the Guyanas, and so this exchange is also involving people in Toronto, in Canada. We're also connecting up with the University of the West Indies that is located in the English-speaking Caribbean. So we've got 6 universities more or less involved in this exchange, which started from 2011. And from the recognition that academic programs in the fields of women's and gender studies are critical to the ongoing production of knowledge about gender identities and social relations more generally, and for understanding the ways in which gendered oppressions are enacted, resisted, and changed. We believe from the outset that these kind of programs are vital to the wider community and provide gender expertise for government policies, research, and planning in order to address such issues as sexual health, gender-based violence, family law, sustainable development, One of the big issues in both Guyana and Suriname right now is suicide and wife murders. So Guyana has the highest rate in the world per capita of suicides, and Suriname follows behind that. And what we're finding is that a lot of it is resulting from domestic violence in the home, where the wife is then beaten up or hurt, and the husband or partner, male partner, then commits suicide himself. Or kills his wife and then kills himself. And that is a phenomenon that's very striking, and in both countries is something that we're paying attention to. From the outset, we've foregrounded women's and gender studies as a site of intersectionality. That is, neither women nor gender can be studied or organized without taking into account multiple positionalities and identities due to the cross-hatched relations of power of race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, ability, and so forth. And the culture. So what we are also interested in is that the cultural constructions of gender and sexuality, we believe, are also different from those of the rest of the Caribbean because of the very specific cultural and ethnic makeup, right? I mentioned the Asian populations, but also having the large indigenous populations, the maroon populations, and that these form a basis of a feminism that cannot be reduced or fit into very neatly into what has become established as a Caribbean feminism, a black feminism, or even something called an Indo-feminism in the Caribbean, as none of these terms cross the Guyana's borders very well. So, for example, black in Suriname is equated with maroon, and the rest of the African-descended population in Suriname is called Creole. In Guyana, Creole refers to a language and a mixture of European and African descent, right? So, how do we use these terms? The same thing goes with Indo. In, for example, Guyana, Indo would refer to Indian, people of Indian descent, whereas in Suriname, it would refer to people of Javanese or Indonesian descent. So these kind of concepts and these ideas are things that we have to grapple with and kind of try to make sense across the two countries as to how we can develop a language and an understanding between us as to what we could identify as Guyanese feminism. The kind of questions that we're grappling with is that because of the intersectional ground the Guyanas hold between the Caribbean, the Amazon, and northern Brazil, we're asking, what does gender look like in this part of the world? How does its specific history constitute gender? And in what ways does gender in the Guyanas confirm or trouble existing Caribbean, black, Brazilian, transnational, or hegemonic constructions of gender? What alternate ontologies or epistemologies do gendered histories, accommodations, and resistances in the Guyanas produce? And how might these inform future struggles, rights, and identifications? So, how do we forge, and it's a question, how do we forge an inter-Guyana's feminism without losing or collapsing the specific constructions of gender and sexuality, without dismissing the richness of languages in the Guyanas, without privileging coastland over hinterland, without essentializing culture into creolite, blackness, Indianness, or indigeneity? It's a challenge. It's a challenge. But this complexity demands that we push ourselves into new feminist territory. So some of the important factors in creating and sustaining this exchange, this academic exchange we have going, was the desire on the part of some feminists in both Guyana and Suriname to strengthen their programs, their studies at the universities, with assistance from the transnational diasporic group, right? While addressing their own very specific histories. Secondly, in relation to the universities of the West Indies or universities in North America or even perhaps in Brazil, but especially if I look around this university, the universities of Guyana and Suriname are similarly underdeveloped, and the countries themselves actually are similarly underdeveloped. Both suffer from a continual brain drain, very weak economies and government structures, large informal economies and underground, and a heavy out-migration of young people, especially of young people. So this affects their capacity within the universities themselves to attract and retain faculty members, professors, and students. And I must say this, the salaries are extremely low in both countries. The facilities in the universities are really poor. They're very basic. And the programs and departments are heavily understaffed. So we're dealing with two countries that have very similar kinds of conditions, material conditions. And they're very weak economically and politically as well. So although they identified the need to have some kind of transnational support from us, from Canada, right, those of us in the diaspora, to help develop the programs, they also see the need, and we also see the need to strengthen the trans-border identification and reliance. In other words, to try to bring these two countries and the two programs, gender studies programs, closer together so that they can actually strengthen each other. Thirdly, although they're linguistically different, and one country speaks Dutch, the other one's main language is English, the cultural and territorial makeup is more similar to each other, and I think I've mentioned that, than to the rest of the Caribbean or the rest of South America. The other factor that's been important is the involvement of Caribbean and mainly Guyanese feminists in the diaspora have been really critical to facilitating the conversation. So we've been drawing upon our experiences, skills, and knowledge to help the local organizing of gender studies. But it also keeps those of us in the diaspora informed and grounded in the local struggles, while serving to identify or to marshal material and other resources that could be outside of the reach at the local level. So this transnational and interterritorial conversation and exchange is, to me, the most challenging and the most inspiring part of the project. So how do we authorize and legitimize, through such academic endeavors, the kind of trans-border or cross-border lives that constitute the Guyanas? And this is something we really need to think about, because it is very hard to work across these kind of borders and to build a program that works for both sides of the border. We've succeeded in establishing the local gender studies programs in both countries. We've organized capacity building workshops. We've had fellowships for some of the students and faculties to spend time doing their own research. And recently, or the most recent initiative that we are developing is a joint course across the universities in Guyana and Suriname, which is now funded by UNESCO, which is going to introduce the students to an intersectional gender and sexuality studies. And it's a blended course. In other words, it will be taught asynchronically, face-to-face, and online in two main languages, English and Dutch. And it starts in January. It's something very new. It's something that we're trying. And it's a pilot, and that we're hoping to introduce it into the 3 universities also in Canada, in order to bring in that transnational and diasporic conversation as well. It's a technologically and pedagogically challenging thing to do, this course, because strangely enough, there are 2 universities that have different infrastructures, different rhythms, different ways of doing things, and to work across those is not as easy as you might think. I mean, we started out with this idea that, it'd be very easy to do a cross-border course, but it's actually very complicated and very difficult. But at the same time, we are invested in trying to make this happen and trying to make it work. And hopefully it will benefit students on both sides of the border. As someone myself who now lives part-time in the Caribbean and the other part in the Caribbean, I think it's exciting to be engaged in this kind of bordered and unbordered feminist exploration. In many ways, the Guyanas, to me, remains a new world, if you like, a place, as my Guyanese father has always maintained, is full of potential. And it's that potentiality that might enable a rethinking of gender as we know it in the Caribbean, with an eye towards an ungendering of the future that this project can hopefully nourish. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Kamala, thank you very much. Muito obrigado. É o seguinte, a gente tem 1 hora e pouco de conversa, de debate, caso haja conversa e debate. A gente tem um problema na sala, um problema logístico, e é que a gente não pode trazer café para dentro da sala. Então, eu acho que vale a pena fazer uns 5 minutos, 10 minutos de intervalo, sair, tomar um café e voltar. A gente tem tempo para fazer isso e acho que algumas pessoas necessitam. Então, façamos 10 minutinhos de pausa, por favor, e aí a gente volta para o debate.